Yeah. Okay, welcome everyone to the Stockbridge Library Weekly Poetry Hour. This is our second season, and the theme is the refuge of witnessing. And we're excited to have Peter Kline come back this year. He was one of our readers last year. Give you a brief bio. Peter teaches writing at the University of San Francisco and Stanford University. A former Wallace Stegner Fellow. He's also received residency fellowships from the Amy Clampett House, which I used to live within a mile of in Stockbridge, James Merrill House, Marble House Project, Art Smith, Orcas Island, and Kimmel Harding Nelson Foundation. His poetry has appeared in Plowshares, Poetry, Tin House, and many other journals, as well as the Best New Poets series, the Verse Daily website, and the Random House Anthology of Metrical Poetry, Measure for Measure. Since 2012, he's been directing the San Francisco literary series, reading series, Bizarre Writer Salon. He's the author of 2 poetry collections, Deviance and Mirror Forms. Welcome, Peter, to our second season.
Thank you so much.
So the first question, as we explore these themes is, where do you find refuge? Where's that place? I mean, for some people in the past, it's been in their writing. For some people, it's a geography. I just want to see where does that live for you?
Yeah, I think it's probably a place, and it's in the actions that I do, probably like for many people. I feel lucky living in San Francisco, especially through everything that's been going on for the past 2 years, because it's a place that, first of all, I love. I think it's beautiful. It's a place where there's lots of green space. I don't have to drive anywhere in order to get to places where there aren't many people at all, and it's just nature all around. And so the city, strangely enough, feels like a refuge. I think we often think of urban places not in ways of being a refuge. We think of kind of leaving the city in order to find places of refuge, but San Francisco has always been a place of refuge for me, and as I think it has been for many people over the years. I think it's always been or for a long time, it's been a city where people come to kind of make a home that they, to kind of intentionally make a home. And that's certainly part of how I feel about it and felt about it coming here. And certainly writing has always been a kind of refuge for me, just that state of mind of that pure concentration of just words always is a way of kind of pushing everything out to the side and just being in the moment. So yeah, both of those things are refuges for me.
And how does that show up, if it does, in some of your poetry?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways poetry or any art can be a kind of refuge because of ideally it creates in the reader a similar kind of effect as it does in the writer writing it, in terms of that kind of pure concentration, that aesthetic experience, that kind of deep understanding and contemplation, and the deep emotion that can come from an experience of art. That to me is a kind of refuge. I don't think that necessarily means, I mean, we often think of refuge as a kind of safety. I don't think that all art should or create a feeling of safety necessarily. That I think art should challenge. I think art sometimes should leave us uncomfortable, and that art can do many things. Poems can do many things, and certainly making us feel good and celebratory can be one of them. But I think it's also the role of art to challenge, to unsettle, to disturb, and to create change that way. So in that sense, I think the idea of art as a kind of refuge is more limited when you think of it in that way, because I don't think that art should necessarily yield a sense of safety.
So one of the questions we asked a few sessions ago, just your opinion. Do you think during the last couple of years people have sought to find refuge more, or have they been, maybe forced to find refuge just because of the, underlying conditions of the world?
Oh, I would think both. I think everybody is searching for everybody I know is searching for comfort and safety um, these days. I mean, we have so much kind of disruption in our regular lives. It's harder to find the kind of safety that we're accustomed to, and so I think people are seeking it out very, very actively. I know I would fall into that category as well. Even just things like kind of going back to things that I love, as a way of kind of touching base with older ways of being, that the kind of sense of safety and comfort that comes from those older ways of being. So.
Great. If I'm looking down at my paper, I'm writing little notes. I try to collect little snippets and just keep notes as we go along. So is there a poem or two you'd like to share with us right now?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. Well, since the theme of today is in part witnessing, I thought I would start with a poem from somebody else, which is really the first poem I think of when I think of witnessing. And this is in part intended as a kind of contrast, because I don't think that my work is doing witnessing in the same kind of ways, but I think it's witnessing nonetheless. But anyway, here's the poem is The Colonel by Carolyn Forche. It's a very famous poem, so perhaps some of you have heard it before. But it is, and it's a poem I also didn't get a chance to talk about with my class last evening, so I'm glad to kind of present it here for those of my students who were able to come today. And this is a poem that's it's dated and given a specific location, and so in that sense, it has a very particular aspect of witnessing to it. It's about 1978 and the political situation in El Salvador at the time. It's a poem by Carolyn Forche called The Colonel. So it's here it goes. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows, there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, kind of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I'm tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground.
Woo.
That is Carolyn Forche's The Colonel.
Wow. Yeah.
And so maybe I'll go ahead and read
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
something of my own here, just to kind of, and as I said, I was thinking of that kind of witness. That's certainly a kind of direct witness that that she was advocating for, kind of being in the room when the big event is happening. I think that's a powerful kind of poetry that can come from that. I don't think it's the only kind of witnessing. I think all of us are bearing witness, in lots of different ways to the things that are happening, and there are kind of direct ways of witnessing and less direct. So I've been writing many poems about the pandemic. It's something that I've been responding to, not always in direct ways, though. So this series of poems that I've been writing are all poems that take on the idea of stories and storytelling, and the stories that we're familiar and comfortable with, and the ways in which the changes that have been happening in our lives these last couple of years, and really it touches more than the pandemic. This is also about climate change and the kind of the rise of white nationalism and the kind of big changes that are happening in society right now, and the way that they influence our stories. And so the goal of these poems is often to kind of capture a sense of the familiar story, and also capture the sense in which those stories are changing and twisting, and not quite fulfilling our expectations. So this first one's called Fairy Tale. The rule still holds. Don't bring it into the house. Leave it at the threshold. There, close to the room where you submit to your dreams, it may finally show itself. Its 16 legs will emerge to sweep it under the doormat. Its foreskin wings will buffet the keyhole window. When you open its flap, the terrible news will swarm the fine hairs on your wrist and forearm. But it will not reach the pantry, where the little sacks of beans are propped in rows like family gravestones.
Very nice. Very
Shall I
nice.
keep reading a few more?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Okay.
Read another one, then I'll jump back in with a question or two. Or
great. So these are these that I'll read at least at first here, are all in that same series. So they're all taking on either a different genre or a different specific story or movie, and again, kind of challenging them or twisting them. This one's called Noir. You've been tasked. The package is yours to carry. No one will tell you where to deliver it or when. If there are rules about how to handle it without hurting yourself, or turning it on, or letting it free, or setting it off, no one will share them. You can't even remember who gave it to you exactly, or see the expression sliding from their face as they slipped it into the pocket of your coat. But you know the night it happened. You know the name of what you thought you were. You know the idea that bargained you from couch to door to street to unmarked alleyway. You know you sat with your back to the breathing crowd and the airborne light, until at last what was behind you took the place in front.
very nice. So what was kind of the inspiration for these kind of story collections?
These are all actually prose poems, which are not something that I wrote very many of. So I think the original kind of artistic inspiration anyway was reading a collection of Joy Harjo prose poems. And she has in those poems a kind of almost mythological approach, a very strange and unsettling kind of approach. And she was writing them in a very different context, but I found them something kind of liberating about the prose poem form, and then just kind of caught the idea of these stories going askew, and it's kind of started generating more.
So we talked a little bit about Refuge, but the witnessing part, obviously, when a bag of beers comes onto the table, that you're, maybe that's overboard witnessing.
Yeah.
Okay, I had enough witnessing. I'm going to leave now.
Absolutely, yeah.
Where do you see, no, who knows? Maybe it's in San Francisco. It's, where have you been witnessing? Where are there opportunities? And I guess, maybe it's inside or maybe it's outside in San Francisco. That's kind of the refuge you talked about. Are there places you would go to where, there would be more witnessing opportunity? I'm just trying to understand where would you experience that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the answer has always been everywhere, and
Yeah.
that's sort of what I'm getting at. We often think of witnessing as a particular political kind of witnessing, of a kind of direct witnessing of political events. That's most often how that term is used in relation to poetry. But I think all poets writing are bearing witness to their own experience in certain ways, and I don't think of one kind of witnessing as being inherently more important than another. That said, I think also these days we're all witnessing big political events right where we are. That it doesn't require seeking them out. We're all living through major changes in society. And probably the internet kind of brings these things home to us, but you can just go outside and see it in the weather. You don't need to do research to find it. We can all tell just from the rhythms of nature in terms of climate change and things like that, that we're witnessing it, and all we have to do is look outside.
And is there a sense that maybe it's the ears at the table thing? People get into a witnessing overload stage where maybe it just doesn't register. There's too much activity.
I think that's exactly right, and that's a little bit of what we were talking about before. I think many of people are. The question is, what do people want from art at different times? And I think that many of us are in the mood for escapism right now. That there is so much bad news all the time that people want comfort, and I think it's important for art to entertain, to provide that. Art that doesn't entertain people, at least in some way, people aren't likely to pay attention to. But I also think that it's the role of the artist to not sentimentalize or to not sugarcoat. And so I think there's a kind of balance between that can be found between giving the reader pleasure, but also simultaneously perhaps making them uncomfortable. And that's a kind of tricky balance to strike, but I think that's one that has to be made.
Yep. So I'm always interested, because we do have some poets that teach writing or poetry. So what kind of things do you challenge your students with?
As many, I try to challenge my students as many ways as I can think of. Mostly I just want them to kind of explore their experience with language in as many ways as I can, come up with. So I want them to think about their lives, to think about what's happening in the world, to think about their happinesses and their heartbreaks, and all of these things, and find language for it. So I have many different kinds of assignments that because different students, I think, respond in different ways and are going to find the right approach in different ways. And so for me, especially in the beginning classes, it's about finding a kind of variety of ways to engage them to get them to hopefully fall in love with that experience of language, of both reading and finding language for their own experiences.
Yeah, no, nice. So do you want to share a few more poems?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll read a few more of these prose poems. This one is called Romance. So this is basically taking on the idea of the marriage plot, the romantic comedy, romance. This story begins with an absence. Whether the absence of what once was and now isn't, or the absence of what never was and has yet to be. The idea of what isn't is present, is ever present in the strong but suffering heart, Hope's heart, this story's protagonist. None of the other hearts is really real. The ending is ideal. As the suddenly, finally intimate couple turns publicly on the public floor, a server on her smoke break watches on and softly coughs.
Nice, very nice.
And this one is called Pandemic After School Special.
There you go. It's extra credit here.
Taking on the genre of, I don't even know if they call them these anymore, probably not, but of teen-oriented, very moralizing stories that often kind of have endings that advocate against premarital sex or drinking or things like that. Probably this is from the 80s or 90s when these were in their heyday, but I imagine they still make them these days. So this is After School Special. Bet you're too scared to make it to the top. 200 feet up, the water tower is a psychedelic space egg, primed for contact. But first, the razor wire, looping like sky graffiti over the dissuasion fence. A fortified neglect. Peel back this chain link flap behind the thicket and you're in. Chug another beer for courage. Then it's up, 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 up the slippery surgical blue ladder. At your back, you can feel an emptiness protract. It is the universe. But your vision is fixed on the work of your hands on the rungs. Then an edge and one last trembling heave, and vista is the reward. Clicks of tiny houses glittering like data points. So many lives, and you can see them all.
Yeah, I think I remember a few high school things. None of which we can reveal here. Perry, I'm going to save those for your reading. We'll go back to the 60s. Yeah, crazy time. So are these stories going to be in a new book that's going to be published, or?
Yeah, there's no it hasn't quite come into book form yet, but yeah, eventually they will be. Yeah.
And is it additional kinds of poetry besides prose, or is it just the story stuff?
Yeah, I imagine this is probably going to be a section. It might end up being a quarter of the book or something like that. Yeah, the rest will be more traditional, lineated poems.
Yeah. So just share with us, because I'm always, and I think our audience is always interested. how does the creative process work for you? People have been saying, hey, I'm going to this special place in my house and that's where I write, and it's my cave or my whatever it is. And there are other people where they've got paper or pen with them all the time, and when things spark up, they get written down. I'm just wondering, how does that work for you?
For me, there's kind of two parts to the process. One is just kind of finding ideas. And usually for me, those ideas don't take the form of, I think I'll write about this kind of thing, subject matter or something like that. For me, it's almost always a piece of language. And then that might develop into a concept. For example, I think the fairy tale poem was the first of those prose poems that I wrote. That started as a piece of language, and then I kind of thought about the concept of it after it, and some more poems came out of it that way. But always the language has to come first. And so the piece of language that starts a poem may not even end up in the poem eventually. But for me, it's a phrase that echoes in my mind. It's something that I kind of sticks in there. I can't get it out, and I recognize it as having potential for poetry. I can kind of feel in that language kind of shimmering that there's something there. So that's the first part, and that can happen anywhere. I mean, when it happens more often when I'm writing more often, and when I have more time to concentrate on it, but it really can happen anywhere. And so, and this is advice for my students, always have something to write on. These days, I think we always have our phones with us, or most of us do. And so, I use the note function on there as much as pen and paper for this kind of purpose anymore these days. In the past, I tried to always carry a notebook around with me, because if you've ever had the experience of thinking of a perfect line and then forgetting it, it's pretty frustrating. So I try to avoid that, any way possible. So yeah, I'm always on the lookout for those lines, little fragments. Some of them never come to anything. But what I'll do then is take those out when I'm sitting down and not currently working on a poem, and see if any of them start to kind of strike sparks, see if any of them might lead to something else. And on a good day of writing, they will, and I'll start to draw a poem out of it. And it may not be, it may take a month or more after that point before it finally kind of fully comes to fruition. But that's for me the process. So it's slow. It requires, there's a lot of waiting in my writing process. I remember Kay Ryan once saying that she, thinking about her partner's experience of her writing, which would be watching her lying on the couch doing nothing for hours at a time. And I can definitely see that, especially with her poem, her poems, which are so compressed and tiny, that there's most of the writing process is a kind of waiting for the next thing. And it's not that nothing is happening, it's just happening in invisible ways. And then finally things come, and one thing leads to the next thing. That's how it works for me.
Great. So let me just take a break right here. We're kind of at the halfway point. I want to let everyone know we do maintain a mailing list just for poetry announcements. If you're interested, you could put your name and email in the chat box, and I'll pull that out and put you on the list, and you'll get a notice next week. I mean, what you also get is you get the recording of the prior week. You can go to stockbridgelibrary.org, and all the recordings are there. You can access the recording. So it seems to be, maybe we have half the people live, and then we have another, half or more that look at it at a later time. People are working at 12 o'clock or having lunch or doing other stuff, so they can't always be here. But I wanted to, just ask the audience if anybody wanted to unmute and ask any questions. I feel like sometimes we we try to encapsulate the questions like in the last 3 minutes. And I think it might be just a good time to see if anyone has any questions for Peter. Should I tell Jennifer she gets
I
extra
will.
credit if she gets the question? Only kidding.
I'm always interested in what you read, Peter. I mean, mine changes so much. Different poets. Now I'm not even reading much poetry, just historical novels and biographies and things. But I don't know. Does it change for you? Your reading?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for me, I always move back and forth between old favorites that I'm rereading or reading more deeply, and then I try to read new work as well. I
Yeah.
think, it's I know the importance, especially of reading new poetry and kind of seeing what other poets are up to, new ways of working and things like that. I tend to get the most pleasure out of my old favorites, and so I've kind of moved back and forth. And as part of my teaching, I think both of those things are important too, because I
Sure.
want to share my favorites with students, but I also want to be aware of new things going on that they might be interested in also.
Sure.
So yeah, I kind of move back
Sure.
and forth between those.
Yeah, I think when I'm stuck writing, I go back to the old favorites. I mean,
Absolutely.
I'm reading Frost
Yeah.
today, you
Yeah,
know,
it's fantastic.
because
There's so much
you know,
in
I
Frost that's worth.
I go back to form. I go back to the form and the meter and the syllables and all that, and it kind of gets me unstuck, I guess. But yeah,
I, I agree. I mean, Frost is one of my kind of touchstone poets as well, and I think it's really important to have those poets who kind of ground you in what you loved about poetry in the first place and get you back to that
sure.
to that feeling. Yeah.
Interesting.
Good. Anybody else? Okay, Peter, we gave him a shot. Can't complain. That's it. Just want to say, yeah, one thing here. Thank you, Peter, for the pleasure of hearing your work from Ellen Steinbaum. So, yep, very nice, very nice.
Thank you.
So, besides the stories, what other things would you be working on now?
That's the only real series that I'm working on. So everything else tends to come in kind of individual poems. So well, there's another very, very small series that I'm working on. These feel like minor poems to me. I wasn't sure whether I was going to read them or not, but they're basically street scenes. And I probably, because I've been spending so much time sitting outside these days, because I haven't been going inside much. I see a lot more in the streets than maybe I used to. So it occurred to me that I could kind of write a series of poems just with things that you see on the street, and it did seem to fit in with that theme of witnessing that you were talking about.
Yeah.
So I have two so far that I feel kind of are done or close to done. So I could read those.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
Of what these might be like. So right now they're called Tales of the City, in a reference to the famous San Francisco book of that name as well. And we'll see. I don't know how many this will finally yield, but here's the two that I have so far. They're quite short, just little moments from the street. This one, I'll give a little background, I suppose. These are both things I actually saw. Not everything in my work by any means is autobiographical, but in some ways for these, it did seem important that these were actually things that I had seen. These are things that I witnessed. And the first one was a strange incident where a woman was leaving a drugstore and putting her money away and dropped some money. And somebody else, without her noticing it, ran and grabbed the money. And I saw the whole thing. And anyway, that's the basic incident that was there. And so here's the poem that came out of it. The new panhandler, scavenging or stealing, that woman's dropped bills. I called out, "Excuse me, but I wasn't excused.
That's great. I love it.
And then the other one was almost seems like it wasn't a real story because it was so surreal. But there it was, right on Clement Street, down the block from the apartment where I live, and so I had to write about it. It's one of the, sometimes you see something and it just becomes immediately clear that there's poetry in it. So here is that story exactly as I saw it. The old man kicking the parking meter kicked it well, though it was almost as tall as he was, pivoting his hips and throwing a sideways leg up high in a whoosh of pleated chinos to get it square in the face, repeatedly, with what seemed to me truly admirable form. If only justice were as common as beauty.
Hmm. Hmm. Nice. Very nice. Very nice. So are there maybe other poems that you picked out for some of your favorite poems, poets you'd like to share?
That was the only one that I
Yeah.
pulled out specifically right now, although I would be happy to do so, but
No, I'd say, yeah, I mean, I think part of this is whatever moves you in the conversation that you would like to share with us. I don't want to, I think you were at the Malachi Black, Malachi, how about just one of your poems? No, Malachi, he liked to, no, he had a great reading, but he really liked to bring a lot of other people into the conversation. So
yeah.
yeah.
Well, if you go, what I do have is a couple more of my own, so I'd be happy.
Fine. Listen, fine. I love it.
All right. Well, this is again on the pandemic. I don't really write that throughout my writing life. I have not written about public events very often, and it's not something that I've found easy to write about. And the poems that I've tended to write when I have felt inspired to write them, I haven't generally kept. I haven't felt that good about them. But for some reason, the pandemic has been different. I've written a lot of poems coming out of it. Some of them, most of them are working more obliquely in relation to it. Some of them are more head-on. This is one of the more head-on ones. So this one is called Social Distancing. Before I know, I'm aware. We say feel, but it isn't touch. It's not touch that I feel. It just feels too close. Where before the air felt free, the air feels bought. I thought that sharing air was easy. Live, let live. And I wanted to give, even uneasily, what should be given, the general good. It could never be too much to do what I could. What can I do when breath is threat and friendship's basic give and take is a contact trace? Even the love letter that I wrote to you and sent with hope was sealed in a protein envelope.
So do you get most of your, you're talking about language. Is most of the language from reading, or is some of it from conversations?
That's always been a kind of negotiation for me. I think maybe because I read so much, I read so much, especially growing up, that I think my natural writing language was literary, and it took and stilted, I think, in some ways. That as a young poet, especially that I struggled with stilted language that I think the phrase is that smelled of the lamp. They say that feels kind of worked over and overly literary. And so kind of being aware of that tendency of mine, it's been a kind of negotiation to always find ways to bring spoken language into my work, even as there's going to be kind of finally always a more literary written quality to it, just because that's so saturated my experience. But I try to find both of those elements, and I certainly listen to the way people talk, because I find that often the spoken phrasing that might not usually show up in a more literary way, there can be possibility. So I'm always listening for that.
Great, fantastic. So we have about 15 minutes left. Once again, I want to make sure the audience can participate. If anyone has any questions you want to throw out, we can do that. Or Peter, you can, read a few more poems, or whatever works. I mean, I love I think, witnessing, you're right. There's so much witnessing every day just by opening up your phone. I feel like your phone is, I don't know if it's the internet Wikipedia of witnessing, but it just all of a sudden it just spews. I feel like there's just stuff flying out of the phone.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think you have to ration it to a certain extent. It's so accessible. The world has become so accessible to us, and when the world is full of bad news, or that you have to be careful and potentially protect yourself.
Hey, someone raised his hand. Craig had a question.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, John. Thank you, Peter. This is my first Stockbridge poetry session, so thanks for doing it. I live in Minneapolis, so I'm not in Massachusetts. I use poetry a lot, and I write a little bit, not much, but I do. But every day I post one of my photographs with a poem, and I found myself gravitating to who I call soul poets, the David Whites, the Mary Olivers, the Denise Levertov. I'm wondering, Peter, who are some of the poets you like? Maybe you've covered this early because I came in a little late, but I'm really curious because your poetry witnessing is interesting because it could be seen as being a voyeur. However, I don't get that from your poems. I get something else. So I'm pleasantly surprised. Thank you. I'm complete.
Yeah, I think that there was some criticism of the poetry of Caroline Porcher or others who kind of came after her for those reasons of that idea of the voyeur. What is the relationship? What is the proper relationship between the poet and political material? What does it mean to a poem if you've in some way kind of sought out dangerous political situations as a way of seeking poetry, and what are the ethics of all of these things? There, I think a lot of questions came about that. I think for me, I've always felt uncomfortable being directly in the spotlight. I try to kind of take a step back from appearing in my poems, and when the I comes into my poems, it's almost always as a kind of mask, and so I'm always kind of looking at the I that's on the page, even as it may express aspects of me, but I'm also interested in kind of examining that eye. And so anyway, that's the answer part of your question. As far as which poets that I like to read these days, many of them are the poets that I've always loved, and so Frost would be on that list. Perry and I were talking about that, or Yeats, or Theodore Rucky, or Sylvia Plath, or many of the 20th century American poets are the poets that I go back to again and again. Contemporary poets. Randall Mann is a poet that's one who I read avidly, and whose work I find to be kind of sympathetic to my own in some ways. He's interested in contemporary language, in the kind of darker kinds of experience that don't always show up in poetry, but that I think there's plenty of kind of place to look into. So he's a poet that I find really compelling. As far as more spiritual kinds of poems, I don't know if you know the work of Lisa Russ Spar, but she's a poet who's really interested in a kind of rapturousness, and sometimes that takes an erotic form, sometimes it takes a religious form, sometimes in her poems there's a kind of blending of those two things, which interests me, and is something that I've worked with myself as well. But with her, the rapturousness also often comes through in language itself, which is she works in the kind of very highest register as a poet, just kind of cascades of gorgeous, difficult sometimes language that can be transcendental. And so I would recommend checking out her work if that's something you might be interested in. It's quite different from Mary Oliver and her kind of plain spoken approach, but I think that it has that spiritual impulse behind it.
Hey, Peter, how do you spell her last name?
Spaar.
Okay. So we had a comment from Melinda Solomon. Thank you for your patience. Maybe talk a little bit about your growth as an artist from when you became aware that it was your calling to where you find yourself now.
Sure. Well, I think when I was a younger artist, I had the things I thought about were, first of all, can I be an artist? Can I make a life out of this? Can I do I have my own voice? Am I too much working in the kind of in the shadow of other writers? Things like that. I had anxiety about those basic things. Now, I feel that I do have a voice. I don't worry about that at all. I don't worry about being too much in the shadow of other writers. Now, I want to make as good work as I can and spend as much of my time doing it as I possibly can. So from a kind of practical standpoint, I think about how to structure my life in order to allow my work to happen, and to also to kind of keep myself open to inspiration and impulse. And I think it's kind of easy to become conservative and to kind of stick with approaches that work, because it's hard to spend a lot of time, say, on a poem and find that it's failed. But in other ways, it's necessary for that to happen sometimes in order to get to a place of growth. And so trying to stay open to those, to failure in some ways, so that new kinds of success can happen. That's some of what I think about these days.
So is there a graveyard for those failed poems? Do they end up in some Tim Burton movie, or what's going on with that?
Yeah, probably that's probably a poem itself there. What the poem about the poems that never come to be. Yeah, a graveyard. It could be. They're packed away in notebooks somewhere, and hopefully they will never see the light of day because they didn't work. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. But in other ways they did, because they made it possible to write the next one.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. So we only have a couple minutes. So anything you want to close out your reading with a poem?
Sure. Yeah. All right. And decide which way to take the final poem here. This is called Urban Nocturne. Knowing your deeper mind, you pour on extra whiskey. Despair is the trickle of ice. Salvation is a taxi to an undercover bar with a suite of blurry suitors, where you give the man a handshake of double-counted dollars, and you catch a puff like powder, and the night zips out from there, and the tongue of an elegant scenester is restored to its elegant lair from its place inside you. You who this morning woke up with a vow to sleep in your bed and sleep sober. All of history led up to now, but the books were enormous and boring, and the stories changed. You emerge from a one-way stairwell. The alley is dawn-tinged, but a single streetlight burns, and your spirit is flat as the planet, and your highways are flooding with blood, and forever is happening this minute, and forever is happening this minute. Knowing is just a feeling. It shouts into the mirror, flares and dissolves. You get moving.
Very nice. Yeah, thumbs up. Very nice, very nice. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for everyone for being on our program. Another great hour. And Peter, thanks for choosing a little freedom of our conversation and just see where it went. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate your readings and your passion for poetry.
Thank you so much, John. It's
Yep.
been a pleasure, and thank you so much to everybody for coming out today. I really appreciate you spending some time with us.
Great. Okay, everyone, we'll be back next week on February 10th at high noon. All right, take care. Have a great day.